A church choir disappeared in 1971. In 2021, police found a sealed trapdoor behind the pulpit. If you've ever stepped inside a rural church at night, when the last hymn has faded and the sanctuary sits in perfect stillness, you know there's a weight to that silence. It's not empty. It listens. The walls seem to breathe with the voices they've heard for decades, keeping each whispered prayer, each choked sob, each chorus sung with conviction. But sometimes they keep other things too, things never meant to be heard again. And if you stand too long in that silence, you might start to feel the air press against your chest, as if warning you that some songs should remain unsung. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about one such song, the final hymn of the St. Mildred's Choir, sung on a March evening in 1971, and how it vanished, along with the 9 people who sang it. The people of the small Appalachian town of Bellhaven remembered that night as one of those rare Sundays when the air felt alive. The sun had dipped early, leaving behind a pale lavender dusk that clung to the clapboard siding of the church like paint. St. Mildred's wasn't a grand building. Its steeple leaned just a hair to the east, the bell inside cracked and stubborn, the pews worn smooth by generations of hands and knees. But for a small community, it was the heart. And the choir, their choir, was the pride of that heart. On March 14th, 1971, the St. Mildred's Choir was scheduled to sing at the 7 p.m. service. 9 members, all dressed in crisp white robes, had gathered in the robbing room behind the pulpit, voices mingling with the gentle squeak of music stands being adjusted. In the front pews, parishioners were already arriving early just to hear them rehearse. One of those waiting was a little girl, 11 years old, knees swinging in the second row, Sarah Whitaker. She was there with her father, clutching a small hymn book, her eyes locked on the door to the robbing room. Her mother, Ann Whitaker, was one of the sopranos. Sarah had watched her mother tuck the white robe over her Sunday dress, adjust the thin golden cord around her waist, and smile at her one last time before the door swung shut. That door never opened again. The clock in the church's vestibule ticked past 6:45 p.m. Reverend Collins stepped out from his office, smoothing his vestments, expecting to lead the choir into their pre-service warm-up. But the robbing room was empty. Not just empty, pristine. 9 music folders lay neatly stacked on the side table. The row of hooks along the wall stood bare. A faint draft tugged at the hem of his robe, and when he turned toward it, he saw the rear door of the robbing room standing slightly ajar, the night air pressing in. No sounds, no footsteps on the gravel outside, just the low hum of the church's old heater and the rustle of paper from the pulpit. The search began almost immediately. Parishioners fanned out across the church grounds, then into the streets, then into the dark fields beyond. Someone swore they saw taillights on the back road leading to the river. Within hours, the sheriff's office had every available deputy combing the banks, spotlights sweeping the black water. The official report filed days later claimed that a tragic vehicular accident had sent the choir's van into the river on the way to a nearby parish, and that the current had carried the bodies downstream beyond recovery. It was a tidy explanation. Too tidy. No one ever saw the van. No one ever found a scrap of it. No debris, no clothing, no sheet music washed up on the muddy banks. Still, the case was closed. Life, on the surface, moved on. But life had not moved on for Sarah Whitaker. Not then. Not in the 5 decades that followed. She had grown up in the shadow of that night, her childhood defined by the hollow space where her mother's voice should have been. By the time she was 18, she'd left Bellhaven, put herself through the academy, and returned as a deputy. Now, at 61, she was the county's first female deputy chief. She'd investigated murders, kidnappings, and cold cases stretching back generations. But she'd never stopped thinking about the choir. She could still see it when she closed her eyes, the way her mother's hand had smoothed the front of her robe, the way she'd tilted her head and smiled as if to say, "I'll be right back." That was the last promise Sarah's mother ever made, and the only one she never kept. In early spring of 2021, the diocese announced that St. Mildred's would be demolished. The congregation had dwindled over the decades. The foundation was failing, and the cost of repairs was more than the parish could bear. For Sarah, it was bittersweet. Watching the steeple come down felt like watching an era die. But she knew the building held memories that were as heavy as they were sacred. On the second day of demolition, she stood on the edge of the churchyard, hands in her jacket pockets, as the crew worked on dismantling the pulpit. The carpenters moved quickly, prying away the wood paneling. But when the foreman swung a sledgehammer against the base of the raised platform, the sound that came back was wrong. Not the solid thud of wood over earth, but a hollow, resonant clang. "Hold up!" the foreman called, his voice cutting through the whine of the saws. The crew gathered as he knelt, running his hand over the floorboards. One of them fetched a crowbar and levered up a section of warped oak. Beneath it, glinting faintly in the dust, was the corroded edge of a steel hatch, flush with the floor. A heavy, square trapdoor. Weld marks ran along its seam, sealing it shut from above. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, brushing away the dust with her gloved hand, her fingers tracing the cold metal. 50 years of dust, of silence, of unanswered questions seemed to hang in the air between her and that hatch. She could feel the eyes of the crew on her, waiting for her to say something, but her mind was already far away, in the robing room, in 1971. In the last moment she saw her mother alive. Her heartbeat quickened, a steady drum in her ears. She had seen enough sealed spaces in her career to know that they rarely hid anything good. But this was different. This was the floor she'd walked on as a child, the place where she had knelt in prayer, the very boards that had once vibrated with the sound of her mother's voice. And now, there was a door beneath it, a door no one had spoken of for half a century. The foreman glanced at her, uncertain. "What do you want to do, Chief?" Sarah straightened, the steel hatch glinting dully in the fading light. Whatever was under there had been locked away for 50 years. Someone had made sure of it, and if there was one thing she knew, it was that the dead don't get to keep their secrets forever. She turned to the crew, her voice low but firm. "We open it." What lay beneath could be the key to a 50-year-old disappearance, or a secret more dangerous than anyone in Bellhaven was ready to face. What do you think is waiting in the dark under that trap door? Don't look away, because once it's open, there's no going back. The crowbar groaned against the seam of the hatch, each metallic creak rattling up Sarah's arm as she leaned her weight into it. The welds were old, their beadlines cracked in places from decades of pressure and the slow breathing of the wood around them. A worker to her left steadied the crowbar's shaft, and together they pried until the steel lip shivered loose from its frame. A rush of stale, cold air escaped upward, carrying with it a smell that made the men step back. Damp stone, old fabric, something faintly sweet and sour like mildew on cloth that had once been worn by a human body. Sarah knelt at the edge, shining her flashlight into the dark void. A narrow set of wooden stairs descended at a steep angle, their treads bowed from age, their surfaces gray with dust. Cobwebs bridged the space between each riser, catching the beam of her light like spun glass. The beam died into blackness after 10 or 12 steps. Whatever lay at the bottom was invisible from above. The foreman was the first to speak. "That's not on any of the blueprints we got from the diocese." Sarah didn't answer. Her mind was already replaying details from the original investigation files, the ones she'd read and reread over the years in the county archive. There had been no mention of any basement room beneath the pulpit. The official structural diagrams showed only the crawl space beneath the sanctuary, barely 3 feet high, accessible through an exterior hatch near the foundation. This was something else, something deliberately hidden. She clipped the flashlight to her jacket, her fingers brushing the smooth metal of the mag light before gripping the railing, if you could call it that. It was just a length of unfinished pine nailed to the wall, splintered and warped by time. She took the first step down, testing it with her full weight. It held. The second groaned, but didn't give. The silence behind her was complete, the crew holding their breath as she descended. On the fourth step, the smell grew stronger, curling up into her sinuses. Dust, damp paper, the faint tang of iron. By the time she reached the bottom, the beam of her flashlight was skimming across rough stone walls. The space was small, maybe 12 feet by 15. The ceiling low enough that she had to hunch slightly. The floor was bare earth, packed hard, with a scattering of what looked like sawdust in places. Against the far wall, an old wooden coat rack stood, its pegs still burdened with 9 robes. They hung limply, the once white fabric now the color of weak tea, the hems stiff with age and some darker stain Sarah didn't want to name just yet. Her light moved on. A wooden table sat near the center of the room, a thick layer of dust softening its edges. On it lay 9 identical music books, each bound in black, their pages warped and stuck together in clumps. Sarah stepped closer, the crunch of grit under her boots loud in the cramped space. She brushed a finger along the cover of the nearest book and felt the drag of dried residue, something sticky that had hardened over decades. Candle wax? Spilled glue? She couldn't be sure. Next to the stack was a small tin box. Its lid was dented, but still latched. Sarah flipped it open, and the beam of her flashlight caught on glints of metal. Rings, a watch, a tie clip. Each item was carefully placed, almost reverently. The watch was a silver Waltham with a cracked crystal, The second hand was frozen between marks, as if stopped mid-beat. The rings were plain gold bands, some with initials etched inside. A.W., J.L., C.H. Sarah's throat tightened when she turned one band and saw the engraving. Ann W., 1956, her mother's wedding ring. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she set the ring back in its place. The gesture felt like placing it back on a hand that was no longer there. On the floor, beside the table, partially hidden under a fallen robe, was a leather-bound book. Sarah bent and picked it up. The cover was cracked, the spine brittle, but the pages inside, yellowed though they were, had been shielded from the damp. She angled the flashlight so the beam fell across the first page. The handwriting was tight and deliberate, looping in a style that suggested someone who had learned penmanship decades earlier. The ink had browned, but it was still legible. March 2nd, 1971. We have begun rehearsals under the direction of Mr. G. His methods are unconventional, but the harmonies are unlike anything we've ever sung. He speaks of blending voices until they are one, a single living tone. He says the bishop himself has approved our work. Sarah flipped forward. The entries grew stranger as they approached mid-March. Notes about locking the doors during practice, about learning songs in Latin that didn't match anything in the hymnal, about candles placed in a circle on the floor and the choir standing inside it as they sang. March 13th, 1971. Tomorrow night, we will perform the Cantus Perpetuum. Mr. G says it will be our gift to the parish, a song that will bind us together forever. March 14th. Only half a page written. They do not know. They will not be coming back. The words blurred for a moment as Sarah's eyes stung. She closed the book, tucking it under her arm. In the corner of the room, her flashlight beam picked out a set of wooden crates stacked too high. She crouched to lift the lid on the top one, revealing rows of glass jars filled with a pale, cloudy liquid. Something floated in the murk. Fragments of parchment, cloth. She reached for one, then stopped. This was a job for evidence techs, not for her bare hands. She heard footsteps above, one of the crew calling down, "Chief, you okay?" Sarah tilted her head toward the opening above. "Send someone for a camera and bagging equipment, and don't touch anything." As she waited, her light wandered to the rough stone wall opposite the stairs. There, scratched into the mortar, were faint lines of text. She stepped closer, sweeping away dust and spiderwebs. The letters were jagged, uneven, carved by a hand in a hurry or in fear. Cantus Perpetuum. Below it, smaller and more erratic, Anne. Her stomach dropped. It was her mother's name. By the time the evidence tech arrived, Sarah had forced her face into the neutral mask she wore at every crime scene. But inside, something was shifting, an awareness that whatever had happened here had been carefully staged, preserved, and hidden away for reasons no one in the official record had dared to explore. The tech began photographing the robes, the books, the box of jewelry. Sarah stood back, letting the images accumulate in the camera's eye. She knew the next step would be to log the items, secure the room, and begin the painstaking process of tracing each object back to its owner. But her gaze kept returning to the leather-bound journal under her arm. It felt heavy, not just in weight, but in the way it seemed to hum with secrets. When she finally climbed the narrow stairs back into daylight, the workers were waiting, their eyes wide. She emerged with dust on her knees, cobwebs in her hair, and that journal clutched tight. No one spoke. The foreman simply stepped forward and eased the hatch shut, as if covering a grave. Standing there, Sarah thought of the last time she had seen her mother, alive, smiling, the sound of warm-up notes floating through the door. Now, those notes were trapped in a place that smelled of stone and earth, in a room that should not exist, alongside robes and rings that should have been buried or lost. She didn't believe in omens, not really. But as she looked back at the hatch, she felt something almost like a pulse in the air around it, a sense that the room below wasn't done speaking, that it had been waiting for someone to listen. And Sarah intended to listen. But to understand what this room was, she'd have to read every word of that journal. She'd have to see where its entries led, even if they pointed straight at the people she'd been raised to trust. She'd have to step into a part of Bellhaven's history that most of its citizens had been content to bury under polite lies and official paperwork. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the journal open, her reading glasses perched on her nose. The lamplight made the ink seem fresher, as if it had been written only yesterday. Her fingers hovered over the first page, reluctant and eager all at once. The first entry began in a tone of reverence, but by the third page, there was a thread of unease woven through the words. Notes about how Mr. G had them stand closer, how he adjusted their breathing patterns to match his own. The Latin lyrics translated awkwardly into English. Phrases about merging spirits, about surrendering the self to the collective, and always the refrain, "The bishop approves." Sarah paused to sip her coffee, her eyes scanning the page again. She recognized some of the names listed in the margins, other choir members she'd known by face, but not by voice. Each note was like a breadcrumb leading back to that night. Each one made her wonder how many steps they'd taken willingly and how many had been pushed. She closed the journal after 2 hours, her mind buzzing. It was late, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. She moved to the window and glanced out into the dark street. A single vehicle sat parked under the streetlight, a late-model sedan she didn't recognize. The engine idled, exhaust puffing in the cool night air. The driver's face was shadowed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sarah turned back to the table, her pulse steady, but her jaw set. If someone was watching her, it meant she was getting close to something worth protecting. And if it was worth protecting, it was worth exposing. But she'd have to tread carefully. The people behind this, whoever they were, had kept it hidden for 50 years. They'd had practice. She slid the journal into her satchel, locked her front door, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, she'd take it to the diocesan archives. If there were records to match what she'd read, she'd find them. And if there weren't, well, that would say just as much. Outside, the sedan pulled away from the curb, its taillights disappearing into the night. Sarah watched them go, a knot tightening in her chest. She didn't know yet who was in that car, but she knew one thing. They weren't there to wish her well. And tomorrow, when she walked into the archives with that journal under her arm, she'd find out just how far the shadows of St. Mildred's reached. The next morning, the sky over Bellhaven was the color of pewter, clouds hanging low as if pressing the town flat beneath their weight. Sarah pulled her county-issued SUV into the narrow alley behind the diocesan archive building, a three-story brick structure that had once been a Catholic school. She preferred the rear entrance. Fewer eyes, fewer questions. The journal lay in her passenger seat, tucked into a heavy canvas satchel that she kept glancing at as though it might vanish if she looked away for too long. Inside, the building smelled of lemon polish and dust, an odd combination that reminded her of her grandmother's parlor. The front desk was unmanned, but she could hear the faint echo of a radio playing classical music somewhere deep in the building. She made her way down the hallway, her boots clicking against the linoleum, until she reached the heavy oak door marked Archives. The door swung open before she could knock. Father Brennan filled the doorway, a tall, angular man in his 70s with a face that might have been handsome once, but was now set in sharp lines of suspicion. His black clerical shirt was perfectly pressed, the white collar spotless. "Deputy Chief Whitaker," he said, his tone neutral. "What brings you to the archives today?" "I'm here on official business," Sarah replied, showing him the folded court order she'd brought. "Looking for records from 1971 related to St. Mildred's." His gaze flicked to the satchel at her side. "The demolition?" "And what was under the pulpit?" she said, watching for the slightest shift in his expression. She wasn't disappointed. His eyes tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see." He stepped back, gesturing her inside. "Follow me." The archive room was large and dim, lit mostly by tall windows that let in the gray morning light. Rows of wooden file cabinets stood like soldiers, each drawer labeled in tidy script. The air was cooler here, the kind of climate control necessary for preserving fragile paper. "I'll need access to any internal correspondence, meeting notes, and maintenance records for St. Mildred's from January to April 1971, Sarah said, "and I'll need them unedited." "That's quite a specific range," Brennan said. He moved slowly toward a cabinet at the far wall. "May I ask why?" She set the satchel down on a nearby table, unbuckled the flap, and laid the leather-bound journal on the wood. The light caught the cracked spine, making it look even older than it was. "Because this was found in a sealed room under the pulpit, along with personal effects of the missing choir members." Brennan stopped mid-step. His eyes stayed on the journal as if it were a snake coiled to strike. "Cantus perpetuum," he murmured under his breath, almost too softly for her to hear. "You recognize it," Sarah said. He shook his head quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Old church folklore. Nothing you'd find in official records." "Then it shouldn't be a problem to give me what I asked for," she said evenly. For a long moment, Brennan didn't move. Then he turned, slid open the drawer, and began pulling file folders. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. He selected a thick envelope, sealed with dark red wax, the edges frayed with age. Across the front, in faded black ink, were the words, "Only to be opened with the bishop's permission." "This is what you want," Brennan said, "but I can't give it to you without authorization." "That's where you're wrong," Sarah replied, holding up the court order. "County judge signed it yesterday. I have full authority." He hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, with a resigned sigh, he set the envelope on the table between them. "Be careful, Deputy Chief. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again." She slid the envelope into an evidence bag and sealed it. That's kind of the point. As she zipped her satchel, her phone buzzed. She stepped away to answer. It was Danvers from the department. "You at the archives?" he asked. "Yeah. Why?" "Someone broke into your house this morning," Danvers said. "Didn't take anything, but they left this." She heard papers shuffling on his end. Then his voice again, lower now. "It's a white card, no writing except in the center, printed in gold ink. Says, 'Let the harmony rest.'" Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "Don't touch it. Bag it and log it as evidence. And keep this quiet." "Understood." She ended the call and turned back to find Brennan watching her with an unreadable expression. "Problem?" he asked. "Nothing I can't handle," she said, though her pulse was ticking faster now. She left the building through the front entrance this time, the envelope secured in her satchel. The street outside was empty except for a lone sedan parked across from the archive, the same model she'd seen outside her house the night before. The driver's face was obscured by the sun visor, but she caught the faint glow of a cigarette. She didn't break stride, but every instinct told her she was being tracked. By the time she reached her SUV, her mind was already running through contingencies. If she was being watched, it meant someone knew exactly what she'd found under St. Mildred's, and they didn't want it leaving town. She drove straight to the station, took the back stairs to her office, and locked the door behind her. The envelope sat on her desk like a coiled secret. She slit the wax seal carefully with her pocket knife, then eased the contents into the light. Inside were black and white photographs, some of them grainy and blurred. They showed the interior of St. Mildred's from angles she didn't recognize, rooms she'd never seen, with vaulted ceilings supported by heavy beams. In one, 9 chairs sat in a circle, each with a music stand in front of it. In the center stood a podium, the kind used by conductors, with sheet music open on it. The camera's flash had caught something reflective on the floor, circles of melted wax, perhaps from candles. On the back of one photo was a handwritten note. "Final rehearsal. Everyone present." The final rehearsal. The night they disappeared. There were also typed pages, meeting minutes from a gathering in early March 1971. The agenda mentioned special liturgical performance, approval granted by Bishop H. The rest of the name had been blacked out in heavy ink. Other lines referred to acoustical preparation of lower chamber and restricted access during ritual performance. Sarah felt the cold weight of those words settle into her chest. Lower chamber. Restricted access. This wasn't an accident. This had been planned. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the photographs spread across her desk. The images seemed to hum with the same tension she'd felt standing in that underground room. Whatever the Cantus Perpetuum was, it had been sanctioned by someone high enough to override every safety and common sense. And now she had to decide whether to confront that authority head-on or dig deeper in silence until she had enough to make it public. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "Stop reading, stop asking, or you'll join the choir." Her gaze flicked to the window. The street below was empty, but she knew better than to think she was alone. She swept the photographs back into the envelope, locked it in her desk, and stood. If they thought a threat would shut her down, they hadn't been paying attention. The last time someone tried to scare her off a case, She dragged the truth into daylight so bright it burned, and she was about to do the same again. Still, as she walked out of her office and into the quiet hum of the station, she couldn't shake the thought that this was no ordinary cover-up. The people behind it had waited 50 years for someone to open that trapdoor. They'd built their lives, their reputations, maybe even their fortunes on the silence of 9 missing voices. And now, that silence was cracking. Sarah had one more stop to make before she decided her next move. If the archives had given her the official story, she needed the unofficial one. The whispers, the memories, the things people only say when they think no one else is listening. And she knew exactly where to start asking. She headed for her SUV, the wind kicking up fallen leaves in little eddies around her boots. Somewhere behind her, an engine turned over. She didn't need to look to know which car it was. What she needed was the truth, and the truth was still hiding. But not for long, because tomorrow she was going back under that church. And this time she wasn't coming back alone. The diocesan archives had given her paper, cold, flat, official. But Sarah knew that paper was only half the truth. The other half lived in faces, in half-finished sentences, in the pauses before someone decided whether they trusted you enough to speak. She spent the morning driving the back streets of Bellhaven, avoiding the main roads where the sedan that had shadowed her might easily spot her. Each turn, each side street was calculated, the way she'd been taught in surveillance training. By the time she parked in front of the diocesan administration building, she was confident she hadn't been followed, or at least that anyone tailing her was good enough to make her doubt it. The building itself was old stone, its facade softened by ivy, the carved saints in the niches worn to ghostly outlines. Inside, the air was cool and faintly metallic, like polished brass. She didn't have to wait long. Father Brennan appeared in the hallway outside his office, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw her again. "Deputy Chief Whitaker," he said, as if her title were a courtesy he was begrudgingly extending. "Back so soon?" "I need access to a specific set of restricted files," she replied. "The ones marked with the bishop's seal, and I need them now." "That's not how this works," Brennan said, folding his hands together. "These records are held under the direct authority of the bishop. Without his consent, I cannot—" She held up the court order again. "We've already been through this." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed through his nose. "Follow me." The room he led her to was deep in the back of the building, past offices lined with bookshelves and framed photos of ordinations and parish picnics. It had no windows. The only light came from a single pendant lamp over a large oak table in the center. The walls were lined with tall metal cabinets, each secured with keyed locks. Brennan unlocked one and slid the door aside, revealing a row of leather-bound ledgers and thick folders tied with twine. He reached for a bundle near the middle, but Sarah stepped closer, scanning the labels. Her eyes stopped on one in particular, March 1971, liturgical events. She pulled it out before he could stop her. The folder was heavy, the paper inside brittle at the edges. She opened it carefully, revealing typed memos, handwritten notes, and several black and white photographs. One memo was dated March 10th, 1971, just 4 days before the choir disappeared. It was from the bishop's office, addressed to all involved clergy and staff. It read, "The performance of the Cantus Perpetuum will proceed as scheduled. Access to the preparation chamber will be restricted to authorized participants only. No deviations from the prescribed ritual will be permitted. The success of this liturgical event is of utmost importance to the diocese." The language was sterile, bureaucratic, but Sarah knew how to read between the lines. Success, restricted access, prescribed ritual. This wasn't a hymn sing. This was a controlled event, and someone had decided it was worth locking people underground for. One of the photos showed the pulpit of St. Mildred's before the renovations of the late 70s. The woodwork was darker, heavier, and behind it, barely visible, was a seam in the floor. Sarah recognized the outline of the trapdoor she'd seen just days ago. In the photo, it was unobstructed, no welds, no boards. She turned the photo toward Brennan. "You knew this was there." His jaw tightened. "I've been in this diocese a long time, Deputy Chief. I know the histories of our parishes. And you never thought to mention that St. Mildred's had a hidden chamber under the pulpit? Some histories," he said quietly, "are buried for good reason." "Whose reason?" Sarah asked. Brennan didn't answer. Instead, he crossed to a locked desk drawer, removed a small brass key from his pocket, and opened it. From inside, he pulled out a sealed envelope, aged paper, the bishop's wax seal intact. He placed it on the table between them. "I was told to destroy this years ago," Brennan said. "I didn't. Not because I disagreed with the order, but because I thought there might come a day when someone needed to see it." Sarah broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. It was a letter, dated March 15th, 1971, the day after the disappearance. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. The participants have been placed in the chamber. The bishop has declared the event a success. The chamber is to be sealed indefinitely. No further action will be taken. There was no signature, just the initials HR. She looked up at Brennan. "Who's HR?" His eyes slid away. "Harold Raines. He was the bishop's secretary at the time. He left the diocese abruptly that same year." "Where is he now?" "Dead," Brennan said flatly. Sarah slipped the letter into an evidence bag and zipped it shut. "This stays with me." As she turned to leave, Brennan's voice followed her. "Be careful, Deputy Chief. The bishop isn't a man you want as an enemy." Sarah glanced back over her shoulder. "Neither am I." She stepped into the hallway, her mind already working through her next move. But she didn't get far. Her phone vibrated, a call from Danvers again. "Sarah," he said, his voice tense, "you're not going to like this. Someone just broke into your house again. This time, they didn't bother hiding it. Drawers dumped, closets emptied. They didn't take anything valuable, just your mother's old hymn book." Her grip on the phone tightened. "They're sending a message." "That's what I figured," Danvers said. "What's your play?" "I'm going to the source," she said. 2 hours later, Sarah stood in the bishop's private reception room. It was an opulent space, all polished mahogany and thick rugs. The air scented faintly of incense. The bishop himself entered with the slow grace of a man used to being deferred to. He was in his late 70s, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair gone to silver. His eyes were a pale, cold blue. "Deputy Chief Whitaker," he said warmly, as if greeting an old friend. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" You can drop the act, Sarah said. She placed the evidence bag with the HR letter on the table between them. I know you were involved in the Cantus Perpetuum in 1971. I know about the chamber. I know the choir never left the building. For a moment, the bishop's smile held, then it faded. You've been busy, he said. Busy enough to know that 9 people disappeared under your watch, she replied, and that you've been covering it up for 50 years. The bishop's gaze sharpened. You think you understand what happened. You don't. The cantus was necessary. There are things the laity cannot comprehend. You dig at this, and you'll hurt more than you help. Necessary for who? She asked. Because it sure as hell wasn't for them. A silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Finally, the bishop leaned forward. If you value your career, your reputation, your safety, you will let this go. Sarah met his stare. That's not going to happen. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to tell her she'd crossed an invisible line. Then you leave me no choice, he said softly. As she left the building, she could feel the weight of his gaze on her back. Outside, the sky had darkened further, the wind carrying the faintest scent of rain. Her SUV was parked halfway down the block. She slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and checked her mirrors. The sedan was there again, 3 cars back. Sarah pulled into traffic, her pulse steady but her mind racing. She'd pushed the bishop, taken files from the archives, and confirmed that the trapdoor chamber had been used on the night the choir vanished. Now, the game had shifted. Whoever had been lurking in the shadows was going to step into the open soon, and she'd be ready, or at least, she told herself she would. Because deep down, she knew the next move they made wouldn't be a warning. It would be an attempt to silence her. That night, she sat in her living room, the rain tapping against the windows, the journal and the envelope spread out before her. Every piece of evidence pointed to one conclusion. If she wanted the truth, she'd have to go back under St. Mildred's. The bishop's warning only confirmed it. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands steady now. If they wanted to play this game in the dark, she'd meet them there. She had no idea that when she went back, she wouldn't just find more evidence. She'd find something still waiting in the silence below, a presence that had been listening for 50 years. And once she heard it, she'd never be able to unhear it. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah parked on the cracked asphalt outside the demolition site. St. Mildred's was nothing more than a hollowed shell now, its roof removed, the walls stripped to bare studs and brick. Floodlights bathed the space in a harsh white glare, turning the piles of debris into jagged shadows. She'd come alone, telling Danvers she was just going to check the perimeter. The fewer people who knew what she was doing, the better. The bishop's eyes, and whoever sat in that sedan, seemed to be everywhere. She grabbed a flashlight from the passenger seat, checked the battery, and slung her satchel over her shoulder. Inside were the journal, a small camera, and a roll of red evidence tape. If she found anything new, she'd want to mark it before anyone else could interfere. The trap door was still there, behind the gutted remains of the pulpit, the welds pried open from her first visit. She stepped around the caution tape and crouched beside it, running her fingers along the cold steel edge. The stale air rising from below smelled the same, earthy, with that faint metallic sweetness that made her teeth ache. She descended slowly, each step groaning under her weight. The flashlight beam swept across the familiar sight of the robes, the table, the tin box with its collection of jewelry. But this time, she didn't linger. Her attention was fixed on the far wall. When she'd been here before, she'd noticed the mortar looked uneven in one section, the stones slightly recessed as if something lay beyond them. Now, with the debris cleared from the floor, she could see it more clearly. The faint outline of a doorway, bricked over and plastered to match the rest of the wall. She set down the flashlight and pulled a small hammer from her satchel. The first strike sent a dull thud through the room. The second knocked loose a chunk of plaster, revealing rough brick beneath. She worked methodically, aware that each blow echoed through the empty church above. Dust clung to her gloves, stung her eyes, and filled the air with a gritty haze. After 10 minutes, she had exposed a hole just large enough to peer through. She angled the flashlight beam inside. The space beyond was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, stretching into darkness. The walls were raw stone, the floor uneven. Her heart thudded. She set down the hammer, braced herself, and began pulling bricks away until she could squeeze through. The passage smelled even worse, damp and sour, like waterlogged wood left to rot. After 20 feet, the passage opened into a small circular chamber. Her light caught on something nailed to the far wall, a large wooden cross. But instead of being upright, it was mounted sideways, almost like a plus sign. Around its center were dozens of strips of parchment, each pinned with a thin iron nail. She stepped closer, her breath loud in her ears. The parchment strips were covered in handwritten names. 9 of them she recognized immediately from the missing choir list. But there were more, dozens more, each one in the same tight, looping script she'd seen in the journal. Beneath the cross was a low wooden box, about the size of a trunk. She knelt, brushing away dust until she could pry the lid open. Inside were more robes, folded neatly, but these were in better condition than the ones in the first chamber. On top of them sat a thick, leather-bound volume. Her hands trembled as she lifted it free. The cover was unmarked, but the pages inside were filled with Latin text interspersed with musical notation. She recognized some of the symbols from the journal entries, the same strange, dissonant arrangements that Mr. G had insisted they practice. At the back of the book was a page of English notes. They weren't a translation exactly, more like instructions. Begin at moon's zenith, align voices in harmonic fifths until the pulse aligns. Maintain circle formation. Do not break sequence until tone sustains without breath. She didn't know what it meant, but the language felt ritualistic and dangerous. A sound made her freeze. A faint scuff from the passage behind her. She killed the flashlight and held her breath. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the soft scrape of fabric against stone. Whoever it was wasn't trying to hide. Sarah's hand went to the small pistol at her hip. "Bellhaven PD," she called quietly. "Show yourself." No answer. She backed toward the wall, the pistol raised, her ears straining for movement. The beam of a flashlight suddenly cut through the darkness, hitting her full in the face. She squinted, trying to make out the figure holding it. It was a man, tall, thin, dressed in dark work clothes. His face was partially obscured by a baseball cap pulled low, but she could see the pale line of a scar running from his jaw to his temple. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was low, rough. "That makes two of us," she replied. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flicked to the book in her hand. "Put that back." "Not a chance," she said. He stepped closer, the flashlight beam darting to the wooden cross, then to the open trunk. "You don't understand what that is." "Then explain it." His jaw worked as if he were deciding how much to say. "It's not just music. It's an invocation. That night in 71, they weren't rehearsing. They were opening something. And when it answered," he trailed off, his eyes going distant. "What happened to them?" Sarah pressed. "They're still here," he said quietly, "just not in the way you think." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Before she could ask more, a noise echoed from the passage. Footsteps, heavier this time, more than one person. The man's head snapped toward the sound. "They followed you," he hissed. "We have to go, now." Sarah hesitated. "Who?" "People who'll make sure you never leave if they find you here." He moved toward the side wall, crouched, and pulled up a loose section of stone floor to reveal a narrow shaft. "This leads to the old crypt under the north transept. From there, you can get out through the cemetery." She looked from the shaft to the passage where the footsteps were drawing closer. "Go," he urged, "and for God's sake, keep that book hidden." She dropped into the shaft, the cool stone scraping her shoulders. The man replaced the floor panel above her, plunging her into darkness. She slid down a short slope and landed in a low, arched tunnel. She moved quickly, the book clutched to her chest, until the tunnel widened into the crypt. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and something older, heavier, like the weight of 100 unspoken things pressing against her skin. At the far end, a set of steps led up to a rusted iron gate. She shoved it open, wincing at the screech of metal on metal, and stepped out into the cemetery. The headstones were pale in the moonlight, their inscriptions softened by years of wind and rain. She didn't stop moving until she reached the SUV. Her hands were still trembling as she unlocked the door and threw the satchel inside, the book resting on top. When she slid behind the wheel, she noticed movement in her side mirror, the silhouette of the man from the chamber, standing among the gravestones. He raised a hand in a gesture that was half warning, half farewell, then melted back into the shadows. Sarah started the engine, her headlights sweeping over the carved names of the dead. As she pulled onto the road, she couldn't shake the man's words. "They're still here." And as the miles slipped away beneath her tires, she realized she believed him. Whatever had happened in 1971, it hadn't ended that night. It was still alive, still pulsing under the skin of Bellhaven, waiting for the right voice, or the right ritual, to wake it up again. And now, she had the book that could do it. Sarah didn't sleep that night. The leather-bound book sat on her kitchen table, its presence too heavy to ignore. Even with the blinds drawn and the doors locked, she kept glancing toward it, half expecting it to hum like the journal had in the underground chamber. She'd called Danvers after leaving the cemetery, telling him only that she'd retrieved something and would bring it in tomorrow. The less he knew tonight, the safer he'd be. The bishop's reach was long, and now she was certain it extended far beyond Bellhaven. Around 3 a.m., She poured herself another cup of coffee and opened the book again. The Latin text, the strange notation, it all felt deliberate, precise, almost like a set of coded instructions. She traced the ink with her fingertip, feeling the groove where the quill had pressed into the parchment decades ago. Whoever had written this wanted it to last. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. She considered ignoring it, but swiped to answer. "Whitaker," she said. The voice on the other end was low, steady, and unfamiliar. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Her grip tightened on the phone. "You'll have to be more specific. You've seen the names. You've read the notes. You think you understand, but you don't. Bring the book to St. Mildred's ruins by sunrise, alone, and maybe we'll talk." Sarah let the silence stretch. "And if I don't?" "You'll end up like them. The harmony always collects what it's owed." The line went dead. She set the phone down, her mind racing. She could call Danvers, set up a sting. But something told her this wasn't about catching a suspect. Whoever was on the other end wasn't afraid of police. They were warning her or threatening her with something she couldn't yet see. When the first gray light of dawn seeped through the blinds, she was already pulling on her jacket and strapping her sidearm to her hip. The book went into her satchel, wrapped in an evidence bag. The drive to St. Mildred's was silent, except for the crunch of gravel under her tires. The site was deserted, the demolition crew not yet on shift. She stepped over caution tape and walked to where the pulpit had been, the trapdoor now yawning open to the dark below. A figure emerged from the shadows near the east wall, the man from the chamber. He still wore the dark work clothes, the cap low over his brow. "You shouldn't have brought it here," he said. "You're the one who told me to keep it hidden," she shot back. "And you did, until you answered the wrong call." Sarah glanced around. "Who was that on the phone?" He didn't answer. Instead, he nodded toward the trapdoor. "They're waiting." "Who?" "You'll see." Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but she found herself following him down the ladder into the chamber. The air was thicker today, heavy with a faint vibration she could feel in her chest more than hear. The sideways cross was gone. In its place was a circle of 9 chairs, each with a robe draped over it. The robes were cleaner now, almost new, but their cut was identical to the ones she'd found stuffed in the trunk. A woman stood at the center of the circle. She was in her 60s, her gray hair pulled into a neat braid, her hands folded in front of her. "You must be Deputy Chief Whitaker," she said. "We've been expecting you." Sarah kept her hand near her sidearm. "We?" The woman's eyes flicked to the shadows, and slowly, figures stepped forward. 8 more, all dressed in dark, formal clothing. None of them spoke, but their presence filled the chamber. "50 years ago," the woman said, "the choir sang the Cantus Perpetuum here. They opened the door, and they stepped through." Sarah shook her head. "Step through to what?" The woman smiled faintly. "Not a place, a state, a resonance that binds voice, body, and spirit into one note. They've been singing ever since." Her stomach tightened. "You're telling me they're still alive?" "In a way. And now, it's time for the circle to be complete again." The vibration in the air deepened, the low hum resolving into something like a sustained chord. Sarah felt it in her teeth, in the bones of her skull. "No," she said, taking a step back. "I'm not here to join anything." "You already have," the woman said, "when you opened the book." Sarah's mind flashed back to her kitchen table, the moment she'd traced the notation with her finger. "You can give it back," the woman said, "or you can take your place. But either way, you'll hear the harmony for the rest of your life." Sarah's pulse hammered. "If I give it back, will you let me leave?" The woman studied her for a moment. "Perhaps, but you'll always be part of it now. We don't release our own." Something in the way she said it, calm, certain, hit Sarah harder than any shouted threat. This wasn't about intimidation. They believed what they were saying. She reached into her satchel, pulling the book halfway out. Every eye in the room locked onto it. And then she ran. She bolted for the ladder, the hum behind her rising in pitch until it felt like it was drilling into her spine. Hands grabbed at her jacket, her arm, but she yanked free, scrambling up into the pale morning light. She didn't stop until she was in the SUV with the doors locked and the engine roaring. Through the windshield, she saw the man from the chamber standing in the ruins, his face unreadable. The woman was beside him now, her hands folded again, watching her go. Sarah floored the gas. By the time she reached the station, her hands had stopped shaking. The book was locked in the evidence room, tagged and sealed. She'd file a report, one that left out the resonance, the circle, the impossible suggestion that the choir might still exist somewhere between the living and the dead. But privately, she started another file, a personal one, just like her grandfather had done in another lifetime. In it, she wrote every detail she could remember, every word spoken, every strange feeling in her chest when the harmony began. Because she knew this wasn't over, she could still hear it now, faint but steady, somewhere at the edge of her perception, the sound of 9 voices holding a note that never ended. And she knew one day she might have to go back. Not as a cop, not as an investigator, but as someone who had heard the harmony and lived. Until then, she'd keep the secret the way her predecessors had, hidden, documented, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to lift the trapdoor. She just prayed they'd be ready for what was on the other side, because she wasn't sure she ever had been.